So again, we are reacting to Many Prophets One Message, and this time it's his video, The Quran and the Secrets of Egypt. And now I really don't care what the Quran has to say about Egypt. I couldn't care less. But it's because throughout the video, he's continuing to attack the Bible over and over again for being anachronistic or having the wrong chronology for some pharaohs and stuff. So I think that we should react to some of them, which I've found throughout the video, and debunk them as the moron as he is. So let us review the video.
When you hear the word Pharaoh, what comes into your mind? Most people think of the supreme ruler of Egypt. This is correct, but the word did not always refer to the supreme ruler. Ancient Egyptian history is divided into different periods. The word Pharaoh, Egyptian Perah, had different meanings depending on the period of Egyptian history. Historically, the word Pharaoh only started being used as a title for the supreme ruler much later in Egyptian history, during the New Kingdom period. Before this, the word meant great house and was used to refer to the royal palace.
Yep.
The Encyclopedia Britannica states, Pharaoh, originally the royal palace in ancient Egypt.
He never gets to the point.
The word came to be used for the Egyptian king under the New Kingdom. Let's now analyze the Quran's accounts about Egypt in light of these historical facts. Like the Bible, the Quran discusses the prophets Joseph and Moses, who both spent time in Egypt. Joseph is dated by scholars to either the Middle Kingdom or Second Intermediate period, well before Pharaoh meant ruler.
And we'll return to this, where the scholarship says that Joseph is dated to those periods.
In the story of Joseph, the Quran repeatedly uses the word king to refer to the ruler of Egypt. He is never once called Pharaoh. Moses is dated by scholars to the New Kingdom period.
Yeah, and we'll also get to the scholarship around Moses when I'm refuting this point.
In the story of Moses, the Quran repeatedly calls the ruler Pharaoh. He is never called king. We can see that the Quran is accurate in its use of language when it comes to describing the leader of Egypt at different periods in its history.
And I'm also going to debunk that notion of the Quran's miracle.
How could the author of the Quran have known this? The only source of information about ancient Egypt that would have been readily available are the Bible-based stories.
And see, this is also one of his points, that he is trying to refute Christians saying that the Quran copied from the Bible. He's trying to refute that. Muslims, they always get very, very passionate when we say that the Quran has copied from the Bible, when it obviously has. And he says the Bible-based stories. Well, what about the Talmud? I don't know much about the Talmud, but couldn't there be something about ancient Egypt recorded in the Talmud as well?
To claim that the Quran copied from the Bible is problematic, because the Bible uses the word Pharaoh to refer to the Egyptian ruler in the story of Joseph, which is historically inaccurate.
But just not.
The Quran cannot have copied from the Bible, because the Quran corrects the Bible.
No, it does not. So that was his point, that, the ruler of Egypt was called king until the New Kingdom. From the New Kingdom, he was called Pharaoh. And scholarship dates Joseph to the Second Intermediate or Middle Kingdom period, where the Egyptian ruler was called king. And the Quran always refers to the ruler of Egypt during the time of Joseph as king, and vice versa with Moses. So the Quran is a miracle. And to claim that it copied from the Bible, that's erroneous, because the Bible calls the ruler of Egypt during the time of Joseph Pharaoh. So the Quran couldn't have copied from there. But the Bible uses Pharaoh and king interchangeably in the story of Joseph. So in fact, yes, the Quran could have copied from the Bible in this instance, right? And so first I'm going to deal with, is it an error for the Bible to call the ruler of Egypt during the time of Joseph? Is that an error? So I'm going to refute that point and the Quran's miraculousness. So is the Bible in error? No, the Bible is not in error, because what the Bible is doing is applying a modern term and throwing it back in time so that the people of Moses' day can understand the previous days by using modern terms. That's not an error. That's not an error. That'll be like me saying that um, that'd be like me saying there was a people in 500 BCE who lived in Slovakia. Well, there was no Slovakia, but everybody knows that I'm just using a modern day term for an ancient area so that people today can understand, because I'm not talking to the people in 500 BCE. Moses is doing the same thing when he's writing the Torah. He's using the term Pharaoh for the ruler of the king of Egypt during the time of Joseph. That's why, right? Because he's writing to his people, not to the people of Joseph. So that's why. So the Bible is not in error. And now let me refute this Quranic miracle. It's not a miracle, because he appeals to scholarship to date Joseph and Moses, because the Quran doesn't do that itself. And we'll get to the Quran's chronology. No, scholarship don't think that a secular scholarship, they don't believe that Moses and Joseph existed, especially Moses. They don't believe they existed. They believe that they were mythical characters created and crafted by Hebrew authors of the Pentateuch in the 6th century Babylonia. They don't believe that they're actual historical characters, but they are just going with the premise. They're just saying, okay, if they existed, then we would place them in these periods. So don't appeal to scholarship, because they just for fun go and play our game, right? They play our game with Joseph and Moses, but they are not actually believing that they existed. So they're just pretending, okay, if Joseph and Moses existed, then we would place them in these time periods, right? So that doesn't help you, right? And you don't know when Joseph and Moses lived. How do you know that from the Quran, right? The Quran doesn't establish a chronology. It doesn't establish dates to know when, how, and so on. The Bible does that first, right? I mean, in the Bible, there is a motherload of chronological notes throughout, especially the Pentateuch, right? For example, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, that's outside the Pentateuch, but still counts, which says that the Exodus took place 480 years before Solomon. Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 says that the Israelites remained in Egypt for 430 years. Right, and so on and so on. How old was Abraham? How old was Isaac? How old was Jacob when they gave birth to their respective sons, and so on, right? The Quran gives you nothing of that. So how do you know when Joseph and Moses lived? How do you know when Musa and Yusuf they lived? How do you know that? You know, because the term Pharaoh for the Egyptian ruler was used even in the third intermediate period, after the New Kingdom. So how do you not know that Moses lived in the third intermediate period? You don't know. The Quran doesn't tell you. It doesn't imply that to you, right? How do you know when Joseph lived? How do you know that? Just because the Quran says king? Well, the term king for the Egyptian ruler was used all the way back to King Narmer, who founded ancient Egypt. So how do you not know that King Narmer, who lived in 5000 BCE, how do you not know that he was the pharaoh or the king of Joseph? You don't know. The Quran gives you no stinking clue as to when, how, you know. It doesn't. So this is not a miracle, and the Bible is not an error, right? So he also made another one, right? around here.
Out of Egypt. The Merneptah stele
There.
is an important artifact that contains the first explicit reference to Israel in the archaeological record. It is dated to around 1208
Right.
BCE. It discusses the land of Canaan and mentions the Israelites in relation to Canaan,
Right.
indicating that the Exodus had already taken place by this date.
Right?
The artifact is contemporaneous to the pharaoh Merneptah.
Yes.
This means that the Exodus had to take place before Merneptah, since Merneptah was alive and in power after the Exodus and not drowned in the sea.
Right.
This establishes an upper boundary in the timeline of the pharaohs.
Yeah, from Ahmose I, who founded the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom, and Ramses II, who was the pharaoh before Merneptah.
From the point of view of both the Bible and Quran, we are now left with 18 pharaohs as candidates who may have ruled during the time of Moses.
Yeah.
Let's now delve deeper into the biblical narrative. The Bible claims that there were two different pharaohs who were in power. The first died while Moses was in hiding in Midian. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. During that long period, the king of Egypt died.
And here he's quoting the book of Exodus chapter 2, verses 15 and 23. He's skipping ahead.
The new Pharaoh continued his predecessor's persecution of the Israelites, and it was this second Pharaoh who was later drowned when Moses crossed the sea. The Bible gives us a timeline for these events. The burning bush encounter with God took place when Moses was 80 years old.
Yeah, according to Exodus chapter 7, verse 7.
So from his birth to the Exodus, there was a span of at least 80 years, during which two pharaohs ruled Egypt.
And see, this is where he's doing his error, but let him, yeah.
Now, there is a big problem if we compare this biblical narrative to the timeline of the pharaohs.
No.
We've seen that the Bible claims exactly two pharaohs ruled during the 80-year period, from the birth of Moses to the Exodus. If we consider the number of years that each of the pharaohs ruled, we can see that there is no 80-year period during which only two pharaohs ruled.
Yeah, and you can go and search this for yourself. There is no single two pharaohs between Ahmose I and Ramses II who were ruling for combined 80 years. But again, it's him doing this error, and in my part 2, I'll give him his due response.
Any given 80-year period will give you at least 3 pharaohs in power. We can see that the biblical narrative contradicts the historical evidence.
No, it does not. And see my part 2 for the response to this error he's making.